Our guest is Ebrahim Rasool. He's ambassador of the Republic of South Africa, former member of parliament in the National Assembly, and formerly the premier of the Western Cape province in South Africa. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
No, Dennis, it's an absolute pleasure being on a legendary show like this.
Thank you very, very much. Freedom Day, just celebrated for South Africa. Tell me a little bit about it.
Well, Freedom Day comes as a hard-won right to vote in South Africa for the overwhelming majority who, by definition of being black, could not vote. And so it comes as a result of long, hard sacrifices and struggle. It comes after 27 years of imprisonment for Nelson Mandela. It comes after 30 years of exile for most South Africans who were in the struggle. But I think it came also with a joyous harbinger of reconciliation, of national unity, and of forgiveness. And so I think that we've transcended a lot of the bitterness of the past and turned South Africa into a wonderful laboratory of how people could be different and how people could unite despite past enmities, and how people can find differences cute in each other as opposed to causes for division.
Turn the clock back a little bit for us and tell us a little bit about growing up in South Africa in the, say, 60s and 70s.
Well, I think my recollections are far more in the 70s, but I come into a South Africa in the 70s where my parents have been absolutely fearsome, or fearful rather, of the tyranny of the 60s. The 1960s would be the decade in which Nelson Mandela goes to jail, the ANC and other political organizations are banned, the leadership of our movement who are not in jail go into exile. There's the killing of people in places like Sharpeville, Soweto, the mysterious death of the ANC, the African National Congress president, Chief Albert Luthuli. And so people grow up into the 70s in a very fearful moment, and that generation who lived through it were traumatized. The generation I come from have no direct memory of the repression of the 1960s. And so we pick up the cudgels. I go to high school in 1976, and so where to? The township south of Johannesburg erupts as students take to the streets, rejecting the system of apartheid, not knowing the fear of the 1960s, having an absolute fearlessness as they go about their business. And so in a sense, there's this revival. And more importantly, it's coupled with an idea called black consciousness, that an affirmation that black is not something to be disgusted at, but that black is something that is beautiful, and that we can live with this black identity. And so a new unity forges outside of the apartheid state. And so that lays the basis, 1976 through to 1980, and the last mile of the struggle against apartheid goes into the 1980s, with young people largely showing their fearlessness.
And you were a teenager, a student activist yourself, huh? Leading boycotts, protests, and such?
Yeah, I think that it's a job description you don't go looking for, but that catches you up. And so I happened to enter high school in the year 1976. By 1980, the second wave of uprisings happened. I'm a student leader and leading those kind of boycotts. By 1983, I get elected onto the executive of the United Democratic Front, which becomes the internal carnation of the African National Congress, which is banned. And by 1985, I experienced my first stint in prison, my first house arrest after that. And then I know that what life is all about.
What did the government have in mind in 1948-49 with this whole idea of apartheid? What did they have in mind? What were their goals?
Their goals were largely inspired by the kind of Aryanism of an Adolf Hitler, the purity of a white race, the idea that they were a chosen people brought to Africa to bring civilization to the continent, to Christianize the continent. And so they're not happy only with the idea of separating different races from each other, but perfecting the art and the science of that separation. That if you can imagine segregation, multiply that by 10. Because in South Africa, they work out which group areas you can live in. They work out which schools you can go to and what you can learn at those schools. And so blacks, for example, are not allowed to learn maths and science. And we're still reaping the wind from that decision, that they're able to work out who can marry each other and who can't. And so they turned us into an absolute science of separation, but not only separation, also dispossession.
So it was greatly different than what was happening here in the United States, huh?
I think it made segregation almost look like just a civil affair. Whereas in South Africa, it was a fine art, a science, and something that white students could study at universities.
Before we go to the break, you mentioned Nelson Mandela, you mentioned the African National Congress. How did you all come together, the two of you?
I went to high school at a school which was known much more for its left leanings and its Trotskyist ideology. And so my conversion to the African National Congress came a lot more because I enjoyed its inclusivity. I enjoyed its focus on activism. I enjoyed the way in which it joyfully understood how it could take the struggle against apartheid, that while there was life and death risks involved, we were still able to celebrate our humanity and not to give it up at all. And so in 1980, my great conversion to what we call Congress politics, the politics of the African National Congress, happened. But I remain ever thankful for the kind of theoretical rigor that I learned from the kind of Trotskyist movement which I emerged from.
212 is a celebration as well for the ANC, huh?
Well, the ANC is 100 years old. It certainly is the oldest liberation movement on the continent of Africa and one of the oldest organizations anywhere in the world. And so I think that this is absolutely significant and comes at the moment of great introspection and reflection for us as we understand the lessons of being a liberation movement and becoming a government.
Let's take a little break. Tell the folks at home, we're talking with the ambassador from the Republic of South Africa. Sit tight, we'll come back on the other side. This is America. This is America is made possible by the National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. Punsan Corporation, forging a higher global standard. The CTC Foundation, AFO Communications, and the Rotendaro Family Trust. Americans know very little about Africa and South Africa. What's the size of the country? Is it a big country?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of a subcontinent. I think that it could easily be a third of Europe. But that's the massive size of the African continent. But as massive as the landmass is the opportunity that opens up across Africa, and I'm getting the impression that Americans are learning more and more about Africa because they understand that the economic salvation lies on that last frontier that the US has been shying away from.
Why do you think we've shied away from it?
I think that the US has always seen Africa, and sometimes justifiably, as a continent that needs its assistance rather than can be a partner in trade and investment and tourism. America has often seen the continent of Africa as a place troubled by the absence of democracy, the absence of the rule of law, the absence of human rights, and made that a precondition before being able to enter into economic relations with the continent. Justifiably in much cases, but I think Africa has cleaned up much of its act in the current period.
Do you think there's some guilt feelings there as well because of our race problems that we've had here in America?
I think that America has also not entered robustly into conversation with Africa because they felt that the discourse would be one of reparations. Reparations for a heinous slave trade that happened over 400 years ago, reparations of a segregation problem where blacks were discriminated against in the US. But I think life has transcended some of those issues. I think the best way to make things right is to continue with very important programs such as the Anti-AIDS program like PEPFAR, such as the African Growth and Opportunities Act that allow African goods to come onto the US market duty-free. But more importantly, I think we can find a way to operate equitably with each other through good trade, good investment, and for the first time, Africa has something to put on the table.
What's the population of South Africa?
South Africa is about 50 million people.
And what is the racial breakdown of South Africa?
Well, we're almost 75% what would be called Black African. Then I think that one is dealing with about 10 to 15% of whites, and the rest would be coloreds and Indians. And coloreds in this case is not the pejorative that it necessarily is in the USA. It's people who are of mixed race within South Africa. And it would describe people like myself as well of being of Malay origin within the South African context.
How about religion? Is it a Christian area?
I think 80% of South Africans would identify with one or other denomination within the Christian faith. That the community I come from, the Muslim community, is at about 3%. There's a good size of atheists, there are Hindus, there are significant population of Jews, and every variety of other beliefs that you can find in the world would be in the great mosaic of South Africa.
There's such a small percentage of folks who follow Islam, yet you've been out in the forefront to try to bring people together, have interfaith conversations. What's your motivation there?
I think it's a responsibility I have as opposed to a motivation. When a small 3% Muslim minority can find peace with itself and peace with its fellow citizens in a country like South Africa, there should be a model in there somewhere for the troubled minorities that find themselves all over Europe, in the United States, and other places of the world. We don't have to be perpetual strangers within our host countries. We don't have to seek to create an Islamic system where we live. We can live where we don't make the rules. We can live according to the values and the objectives of our faith without necessarily wanting to insist that every rule and regulation should be inscribed in that country. And South Africa has reaped, and South African Muslims particularly, have reaped all the benefits of living democratically, abiding by human rights conventions, by subscribing to the rule of law, and embracing every other variety in the country. And therefore, we have found peace amongst ourselves and peace with our neighbors. And that's the elusive model that the Muslim world is looking for. And that's the elusive model that Western countries are looking for in trying to understand this phenomenon of the other who happen to be Muslim coming and living cheek by jowl with him.
Many languages in South Africa, many different cultures.
South Africa has an enormous number of tribes, each with their own traditions and cultures. South Africa has 11 official languages. And it's official because we have vowed to ourselves that never again will someone be excluded on the basis of language. And so if you happen to be in trouble in court, you have the right to defend yourself in the language of your choice. If you are lying on your deathbed in hospital, you have the right to demand that someone treat you who can communicate with you.
How interesting.
If you speak in Parliament, you have the right to simultaneous translation based on the language that you choose so that you are not misunderstood. So much of our tragedy of our past comes from the simple fact of not understanding each other. And the South African flag is a flag with 6 colors, the most in any of the world. But it is shaped in a way to converge the colors of the liberation movements, the colors of the old National Party, the colors of the left, the colors of the right, all into one flag. And we have an anthem that encapsulates 4 or 5 of our languages in order to create the same atmosphere of inclusivity and unity. And so we will rather do more than be minimalist and hurt people in the process.
How many countries in Africa?
54.
54 countries. And South Africa has the largest economy. Is that fair to say, or one of the most successful economies?
South Africa has the most diversified economy.
Okay.
It has far more products than any other African country. It is much more industrialized than any other African economy. Its growth rate is much less than, say, Nigeria's or Angola's. But that's because we're so integrated in a world which is in recession. Whereas if you have a single product like oil, you can really grow phenomenally. And that, I think, speaks about the power and the diversification of the South African economy.
What are the exports? What are the leading exports?
Well, South Africa exports what everyone knows, gold and diamonds and minerals and so forth.
Right.
What people don't know is, for example, that every C-Class Mercedes-Benz and every 3 Series BMW that drives in the USA is manufactured in South Africa.
Is that right?
What people don't know is that some of the finest wines are exported from South Africa. That's the legacy of the French Huguenots that came there over 400 years ago. What we supply the US market, and any shopping center would, in the off-season of the US, find our citrus and other fruits that come here. And so we do that, but we do very sophisticated stuff, such as, for example, we are the only country that have destroyed our own nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And we now use that nuclear, we've put it to peaceful use, and so it now comes as nuclear isotopes that treat cancers in the United States of America. And so those are the variety of exports that I think, and many more.
Did I read someplace that the United States still owes a trip over there to pick up some nuclear waste?
They'd like to pick up all of that nuclear waste and control it themselves. We've told them that unlike the United States, we've destroyed our nuclear weapons, and therefore you can trust us to use that nuclear waste.
So we don't have to go pick it up?
You don't have to pick it up and then sell it back to us. We'd rather sell it to you as medical isotopes.
President Jacob Zuma, a hero, came from very, very humble beginnings, a guerrilla fighter himself, also very controversial. What are his challenges? What are the challenges of South Africa?
I think that we'd love to have the United States unemployment rate of under 9%. Ours is probably closer to 30%.
Whoa.
We'd love to have our young people really skilled, really educated, on top of maths and science, and being able to contribute to the technological age and to the knowledge economy. Unfortunately, a past where young black students could not learn maths and science to compete with the world, it takes 2 generations. One generation simply to get the teachers to teach it, and the second generation to get the first products of maths and science getting into universities and into the economy. So we're on a long haul with our skills shortages.
So jobs be one.
Absolutely.
So there is poverty in the country.
There is a significant amount of poverty, and that poverty is income poverty, meaning people who don't earn any money. But at the same time, we have diseases that we need to combat, like HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, and in some places, neglected tropical diseases. But we also have problems of a first world nature, like cardiac, respiratory disease. So I think we've got all of these things coming, and therefore President Zuma's challenge is how to ensure that we get the right skills, that our economy continues to grow, but that for the very poor, there's a safety net that stops the bottom of the world from falling out.
Some concern as far as investment, and I know that you have a background in economic investment, in finance. because of infrastructure and crime, huh? That sometimes scares people off from investment. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I think that people are very surprised when they come to South Africa and find that we probably have some of the most postmodern airports. Certainly, after the World Cup 2010, our airports are anything better than what I've seen at Dallas or JFK or whatever the case may be. It's really postmodern. Our road infrastructure, we've used the World Cup to really modernize our road infrastructure. We've got monorails that's now beginning to develop as a result of that investment. So we didn't put our money into building only stadiums. We put our money into a road network, a rail network. We now have 100 locomotives that we've bought from General Electric that's kept the Erie gates open and so forth. And so I think people are really surprised by the amount of infrastructure they've really seen. And I think that certainly on the level of crime, the statistics are terrible, and unfortunately, a lot of that is inner city as opposed to between South Africans and people who visit there.
My sister-in-law was there within the last year and said it is a beautiful country with very welcoming people.
Absolutely, and that is the story of World Cup 2010. And the biggest chunk of visitors came from the USA, and they were pleasantly surprised.
The relationship between South Africa and the United States, is it good? Is it healthy? Is it progressing?
I think that it's at a level where it should be. It is favorable enough for us to be seen as a friend of the USA, but it is critical enough for us not to be seen as a client of the USA. And I think that that's a really important balance, that we enter into negotiation with the USA on any given matters. The current one, sanctions on Iran, we have our perspective, but at the end of the day, we'd prefer the sanctions to work than another war to erupt in the Middle East. And so we cooperate on those kind of things. We cooperate on ensuring that there are no blood diamonds from Africa on the market. We cooperate to ensure that democracy is brought to Syria. But I think that we would retain sufficient independence and autonomy so as not to simply endorse military options and unilateral actions by a country like the USA.
That was kind of interesting. You said that these are my words, not yours. That you're not there as you know, somebody who's necessarily a client, you know, of the United States, because actually the trade percentage is fairly small. It's big, but it's fairly small. Some of your trading partners go all over the place, right?
No, I think that that the trade proportion is probably proportional to what South Africa has to offer the USA and what the USA is willing to offer South Africa. But the moment of opportunity will come when Africa follows up on the growing democracy, the rule of law, and all of those kind of things with a kind of economic architecture in which the whole of sub-Saharan Africa becomes one common market.
Yeah.
And South Africa becomes that gateway into that common market.
What kind of a timetable do you see for that happening?
Well, the three regions have signed up already. East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. We will get that market going. The West Africa will join fairly soon. We are speaking about a matter of 2 years or so for that to be in place and for the common market to be offered to the USA.
Does it help that President Obama is the President of the United States right now with the relationship?
Ironically, there's a very favorable reaction even to President Bush, because he had really kept the issue of PEPFAR, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, on the table. But that relationship has just multiplied with the emotional cord that also comes from having a person who traces his roots to Kenya in the White House. And so I think that for the United States, that has been a wonderful thing, because it doesn't have to really put in so many billions of US dollars to ensure security in Africa, to put down terror that could emerge from Africa. I think there's a nice secure atmosphere that the US can be thankful for.
We're down to our last 30 seconds, Mr. Ambassador. What one thing would you like folks who are listening to us to take away from our conversation?
I want to say that amongst all the export products that South Africa has, the most important one would be those that relate to the life, legacy, and values of Nelson Mandela. We need someone who is known as a peacemaker. We need a world that is gentler. We need a world that is far more aware of the human instincts between people, and that is what we are going to be doing as our diplomacy in the USA around a statue for Nelson Mandela in Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. A terrific education and conversation.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to be here.
Thank you. For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. This is America is made possible by the National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. Punsan Corporation, forging a higher global standard. The CTC Foundation, AFO Communications, and the Rotondaro Family Trust.